Welcome to the Radiant Astrology podcast, where we illuminate the wisdom of the cosmos for spiritual insight and soul-level healing. I'm your host, Christina Caudill. Thank you for joining me.
Hello, this is Christina Caudill with Radiant Astrology, and in today's episode, I'll be discussing the Libra Equinox and the full moon in Aries, a very potent one that is conjunct Chiron, the wounded healer, and we'll do a deep dive into how this is significant not only for today or for this month, but actually for this coming season, which we'll explore in just a bit. First, I wanted to thank my reviewers on the iTunes app. If you go on the iTunes app and you download my podcast, you can see my reviews. And you know what? I have 2 reviews from 2 years ago that I never acknowledge, and they're amazing. And I wanted to thank you, Stacy B, if you're still listening after 2 years. She says, amazing, great for skeptics. I've always thought astrology was pretty hokey. So many claim to be astrologers and offer bogus forecasts. But Christina has made a believer out of me. She talks about astrology in a way that's down to earth and easy to understand. She also thoroughly researches all sides of a controversial topic before offering any information. She doesn't, quote, predict anything the way the hokey magazine writers predict events. Instead, she talks about why events happen, what they mean, and how they apply it to our life. Ultimately, we decide what we want to do based on the information presented. So much to write, so little space, but so much love for Christina. XO Stacy B. Stacy B, I love you. You're amazing. Thank you. There was also one from Jennifer Neal, Radiant Astrology fan. Great podcast. Always love Christina's astrological expertise and insight. She's always well balanced and accurate in her guidance. I so appreciate that. Thank you so much. And anyone out there, if you want to share some love on the iTunes app, send me a rating and review. It really helps this podcast to be wider dispersed and for more people to get the love and get the Radiant Astrology. So I so appreciate that. I also had a couple of announcements. I don't know if you had seen my webinar, Predict Your Next 12 Months, that I just did this past week, but it was amazing. We had so much fun. We used the solar chart, which is actually a really simple technique that whether you are a beginner astrologer or, beginner new to astrology or a seasoned astrologer, it can be very insightful to look at your solar chart, and it gives you the theme for the month ahead. And I had my expert horoscope writer from Harper's Bazaar magazine, Rebecca Gordon. She shared her insights on how to use the solar chart to predict your monthly calendar, your cosmic calendar. And if you want to grab that recording, go ahead onto bit.ly/predict recording and you'll get the download. You can access it only until October 1st, so make sure you get that. Again, it's bit.ly/predict recording. Rebecca also, she actually gives you your solar chart. So whatever your zodiac sign is, it's included in the free gift that you'll get with the email. As well as some details on how to use them. She is so super generous. She's an amazing astrologer and teacher. And she also has a beginner's course, which starts October 4th. And when you sign up to get the recording, you'll get all the details on that. You'll also save 10% on the course by signing up by September 27th. That's this Thursday. So if you're curious about that, make sure you get that recording and you'll get all the details. Okay. My other announcement that I'm super excited to announce, it's been driving us crazy because it is a huge undertaking, but myself and my friends at New Paradigm Astrology are actually launching a major course, right? It's an evolutionary astrology course. And we're going to launch it in phases. And we're going to start with the very beginning foundations, and then just put it all together, get more deeper into the evolutionary astrology perspective and the techniques that you can use to really dive deeply into an astrology reading. And it's called Astrology for the Soul, the Complete Program. And this course starts actually at the end of October. So we're just kind of announcing it now. You'll get more details as we get further into the launch. The dates you want to put on your calendar are the free webinar, which will be October 13th, where we'll do an introduction to the course. And then the course begins October 25th. And if you sign up right away, of course, we want to thank those who sign up right away, and you'll get special discounts and bonuses and all this great stuff. So just be sure that you are signed up to radiantastrology.com to my newsletter, and you will get all the details. Now, New Paradigm Astrology is a collective of evolutionary astrologers, and they are a big deal, all of them. I'm kind of like, I'm like the scrappy up and comer. I just got extremely fortunate that I can call these people colleagues. It's headed by Kai Pacha, Tom Lesher, that you may know from the Pele Report on YouTube. He's our big kahuna. We also have, our legendary Maurice Fernandez, who wrote the book on evolutionary astrology. He has a great book on it. The Astrology and the Evolutionary of Consciousness, I think it's called. And Sewell Jonathan, who is also just an incredible, legend in evolutionary astrology. I mean, she's young to be called a legend, but I can call her that anyway. Ari Moshe Wolf, also just an incredible teacher and astrologer, as well as my dear, dear friend, Tim Halloran from Risa Healing. I think that's the name of his business. He's also on YouTube. And they're just an amazing group, as well as our friend Julia Simas from the Cosmic Intelligence Agency. She is going to bring in what she does best, which is astronomy, and actually looking at the chart from the perspective of astronomy, which is so incredibly valuable, which I wish I had when I was starting to learn astrology. We are really starting from the foundation. So this part 1 is Evolutionary Astrology Foundations. It'll be $350, 7-week course. There'll be a discount if you're already a member of New Paradigm Astrology. So you want to look into that. And we'll start with really focused on the elements and the basics of the evolutionary astrology tradition and lineage, and what evolutionary astrology means as far as the development of the soul. What is our perspective when it comes to astrology? Because, it is very sort of particular when it comes to what our viewpoint is. And that is that ultimately the soul is really what we're here to express in this lifetime. And so if that calls to you, then you'll definitely want to join us. So again, sign up at radiantastrology.com and you'll be getting all the details here very soon. Okay, so on to the juicy bits of the Libra Equinox and the Aries full moon. Now, the Libra Equinox, we often refer to it here in the Northern Hemisphere as the fall equinox or the autumnal equinox. In the Southern Hemisphere, they're experiencing the spring equinox. And it's interesting because I have so many listeners in the Southern Hemisphere now. I can't just brush it off. We have to acknowledge that we're so connected now with the internet and with, obviously our podcasting and the reach that we have, that even though astrology can really speak to our human experience, it is based a lot on the seasons, at least Western astrology is. So these turning points of the equinox are very significant. And so it's worth acknowledging that the Libra equinox, the sun ingresses Libra. It's also called a Libra ingress, right? So when a planet enters a sign, it is called an ingress. So the Libra ingress is when the sun enters Libra at 0 degrees Libra. And that is the symbol of balance. So Libra is the sign of the scales. And an equinox, we think of equal. The day and night are approximately equal length. So it's a period of transition. If we think of the extremes of summer, which we're coming out of in the north, and winter, which they're emerging from in the south, we're in this sort of transitory season. And in some ways, it kind of seems like a relief. I think when we think about in terms of where we are in the cycle of the year and the seasons. Now, the sun is considered in its fall in Libra because the sun is about our ego consciousness. So it being exalted in Aries, the opposite sign to Aries is Libra. And so that does call for us to find balance. And Libra is the sign of the other. It's the other. We tend to look at it when we look in terms of the natal chart. It is the 7th house, and that is, marriage and partnerships. It's also open enemies. It's the sign ruled by Venus, one of Venus's signs. Venus's yang sign. And we are always in sort of comparison and contrasting with another. So even though most of us know that people with the sun in Libra, they tend to be, obviously there's more than just the sun, but they tend to be people that we think of as pleasant, because this sun in Libra is not just focused on its own ego consciousness. It is trying to find harmony and balance with others. Or maybe disharmony and trying to go to extreme with others. I mean, there is a sense of extremity with Libra as well. Not every sun in Libra is super pleasant, right? But ultimately, Libra is a sign of cooperation and acknowledging others in your existence. It's the principle of balance. Balance and imbalance. The sign of the scales is about justice, right? And justice is something that has to be strived for. Justice just doesn't happen in, say, for instance, our legal system on its own. We have to put it into place. We have to consciously decide what justice looks like, and have these guards in place to maintain justice. And so when we think about this season being the season of justice, a season of coming back into balance, and with Libra being ruled by Venus, we look to Venus. Like, where is Venus now? Venus is in Scorpio. And Venus in Scorpio is very particular. Because Scorpio is the depth. It is intensity. And Venus is very intense there. Of course, she's considered in her detriment there. And that, has its own significations, but we're looking at these sort of intense connections when it comes to relating. And Venus in Scorpio is very different with Venus in Libra. She's less worried about getting along and making sure everything is even. She'll go to extremes because her purpose is ultimately, the authentic experience of bonding. And I'll have more to say about that in the coming months as we get into Venus in Scorpio. But when we're looking at this Libra equinox chart, the Libra ingress chart, what this chart signifies is the influences over the next few months, right? Through the winter solstice or the December solstice, right? It'll be the summer solstice in the Southern Hemisphere. And so we can get a sense of what the major themes are for this season by looking at this Libra ingress chart. So it looks to be very intense. This fall season will be shaped a lot by that Venus in Scorpio, not only because of, it rules the Libra ingress, but it's also going retrograde from October 5th to November 15th. And so when we look at the rest of the equinox chart, what really stands out is the sun is conjunct Mercury in Libra, right? It was just recently past the exact conjunction, but they're still tightly traveling together. And Sun Mercury together is about sharing of ideas, talking things through, and it's important to really will want to bring in sort of the concept of receptivity and listening, because Mercury is about talking, and with so much emphasis on talking and balance and Libra and weighing all options, the mind can be moving very fast because this is an air sign in Libra. That talking and sharing is very emphasized. I would say the one thing that we want to really be focused on is also making sure we're listening and we're receiving, because ultimately Libra is about sharing and receiving. And so Mercury in Libra can tend to be indecisive, because we have so many options. We want to weigh a lot of options. But the beauty of that is, we're not making just single focused decisions, or just, decisions of the limited mind. We're actually sort of looking for multifaceted ideas that we can really be a lot more thorough in our thinking. I mean, Sun Mercury people tend to be highly focused on their own goals, because when you think about the sun being about our purpose, and Mercury being the mind, when we have these conjunct, then that can really help to focus on our purpose. And in the sign of Libra, the focus can be a lot on relationships, on cooperation, and again, that theme of balance. And so perhaps there's going to be a need for discussing all about the imbalances, or maybe even the injustices that need to be righted. Looking at relationships. How do we define and redefine relationships? Finding ways to make them more balanced, more equal. And now the Sun Mercury in Libra is opposite Chiron in Aries. And so Chiron in Aries, and Chiron is retrograde now. It makes me think of the quote by Carl Jung that was, there is no coming to consciousness without pain, right? And so coming into consciousness, the conscious awareness of where we are, where we stand in relationships. And there may be some pain that needs to be acknowledged, some wounds that need to be expressed, and not just with ourselves, not just the illumination of it with ourselves, but this opposition is suggesting in relationships with others. So here we have this repeating theme here about, pain in relationships, imbalance or injustice, and needing to find a way to move through it, to do the work to heal. And so at the equinox, the moon was in Pisces and applying to Neptune, which rules Pisces. Right, so that's a lot of Pisces, and this moon in Pisces can make us very emotionally sensitive. The high side is compassion, empathy, intuition. Some of the downsides can be indulging in escapism or wanting to numb our pain or our grief or sorrow. So this is a big part of the signature of the season that will likely have this emotional processing to do. Now, the beauty of Moon, Pisces, Neptune is it can be a very creative aspect. And when I think of these archetypes, it's really about the dreamy side of Pisces and Neptune, where Creativity can be beautiful, fantastic, filled with fantasy and mythology, or music and poetry and visionary images can really help to heal at the subconscious level. We access the subconscious through myth and through metaphor and through fantasy and creativity. And of course, through dreams. And so thinking about this sort of Piscean, Neptunian theme in the background, where there's so much of this, Mercury sort of discussing and trying to weigh all options and kind of getting down to the bottom of things and trying to find a way to find balance and justice. We want to really acknowledge, the deeper emotion of that Pisces needing to heal on an emotional level. Like that's really the impetus for all of this. And so something that comes to mind is that trending hashtag that emerged over this past week, why I didn't report, which seemingly is a continuation of the Me Too movement, with women sharing their really painful stories of what kept them from reporting their sexual abuse or their sexual harassment, or maybe they did report it and how they weren't heard when they did. And so this seems to be reopening these old wounds, yet again, not only from, back when Me Too started, but also from, when these abuses originally occurred. So it's very much an emergence of these collective wounds that need to be voiced and acknowledged, and in a way that is helping to forward justice, justice that maybe we could never fully get justice for that which happened to us in the past, but voicing it is a cathartic way of actually just releasing it and giving it up for healing. And so what's interesting is then just a couple of days after the equinox, we have the full moon in Aries. And so, we see this time as being very much representative of what will be unfolding this season. And of course, Aries is opposite to Libra, the sun in Libra, which is about balance, the other. And Aries is I am, myself, my identity. And so the full moon in Aries is exact at 10:52 p.m. Eastern time on Monday, September 24th. And full moon in Aries, a full moon is always, this, and we can call it crisis, or we can just call it a time of release, a time of polarization of the moon opposite the sun, our solar ego opposite our emotional nature of the moon. And this feels like a big one because Aries is ruled by Mars. And Mars is about initiation and often about anger or fiery emotion. And we look to where is Mars? Mars is now in Aquarius. It's now direct. It's been in Aquarius for a while now since that's where it went retrograde. And so Mars in Aquarius has really brought up a lot of these themes of rebelliousness, often in issues involving things like friends and networks, or our higher ideals, our causes, what we want to achieve in terms of society, right? And so, rebellion, revolt, that type of thing, that will certainly continue to be a theme. And Mars is about sort of the individual taking a stand or initiating something. And with the full moon in Aries conjunct Chiron, our wounds are illuminated. Chiron, we know, is both the wounded healer and the maverick. I remember there was a time when it seemed like you had to choose a side. Chiron was either about the wounds or about being a maverick, at least among astrologers. And I think the more that we unpack and observe Chiron, we can have more of a complete picture of what Chiron is about, because Chiron still is fairly, a recent discovery, 1977. And, it isn't, Chiron, I've discussed Chiron, I think, in other podcasts. He doesn't have a normal orbit, right? It's a very elliptical orbit. And so we see Chiron as, first of all, when we look at the mythology, the wounded healer, the great mentor, where our deepest wounds lie also our greatest gifts. But we can also use that to our advantage. We can adapt to those wounds and really become something else. And when I think of adapt, it's like literally adapting, like, morphing into, a completely new version of ourselves, or different version of ourselves, in order to create something unique about our identity, which is what Aries ultimately is about. And ever since Chiron entered Aries in April of this year, there's been this collective impulse of doing things differently. I see so many people with this Chiron in Aries signature, especially if it's like opposite Uranus, which really is about being an inventor, and to invent something, you're inventing something out of nothing, or doing something totally unique to you. And there is no previous precedent for it. It's unprecedented. So doing something unprecedented, doing something totally unique. Maybe you're creating a completely new identity of yourself, regardless of whether you'll be ridiculed or whether you really know 100% what you're doing. You might not know every step, but you're ready to dive in. And so, let's face it, we're in a time of the wild, wild west, just in general, in our society, in our culture. There are so many possibilities at this time in history, and so many chances to create our opportunities. And whether that be in activism and sharing our voice, speaking truth to power. So many people who never thought they were political, are now realizing how dangerous it is not to have a stance, and not to speak out, or just they're willing to do so regardless of the consequences, because it's just that important to speak out against injustice, and to determine what justice is. And even when we look at creating our own livelihood, we have opportunities to do it in ways that we've never conceived of before. And it makes me think of the astrologer Kelly Surtees, who recently in a podcast, the astrology podcast, had said that, she started becoming an astrologer when she was in her 20s. She started in her astrology business. And she's very successful now. It's like, I don't know, I think she said she's maybe in her 40s or something. And she was asked, how did she just sort of get up and running so early, so young? And she said, because she didn't think of it as weird, and it's interesting she said that, because I see so many people, and I even had that myself in the beginning, that, maybe you waste the first 3 to 5 years, or maybe even longer, just not putting yourself out there, not identifying as, say, for instance, an astrologer, because other people will think it's weird, or because I don't know any professional astrologers, how am I supposed to do this? Who am I supposed to be? How am I supposed to present myself? And sometimes, I really give kudos to Kelly, to just go and do it and just say, you know what? I'm calling myself an astrologer. I'm doing it this way. I know enough. What I don't know, I'll learn along the way. I remember going to a conference, and there was this major serial entrepreneur there. She started some major companies. I don't know, she was probably in her 40s by that time. And she said, how you get started is you get your first client, and then you start asking your client, what they want, and you serve that client. And that's how you get more clients, and that's how you become professional. That's how you know what people want, right? And so, whether we're talking business or whatever it is in your life where you are called to take a chance to go out on a limb, that's been sort of a theme for many people that are, where this Chiron is aspecting their chart in Aries. Because Aries is that impulse of initiation, of, breaking free from, the ending of Pisces into a new birth, into a rebirth in Aries. And so Chiron has then gone retrograde and we'll be heading back to Pisces. And so, maybe now our vulnerabilities are starting to become even more a little pronounced. Maybe we're starting to doubt ourselves. Maybe we're starting to doubt that initiation that maybe in the spring was so strong. And now we realize, we need to be stronger. Maybe we're a little wobbly on our courage or on our initiation. And with this Libra season, maybe we need to lean on others for support or ask for support and know that we don't have to do everything alone. This full moon will be highlighting where we're at with this Chiron in Aries. Maybe this is a time where we're questioning the identity that we've created for ourselves. Who am I to do this? What does this say about me that I'm presenting myself as this person in this way or as an expert? Am I an imposter? Am I worthy? Do I have what it takes? All of these kinds of things can be coming up with the Chiron in Aries being highlighted. And then when we look at it in terms of the opposition, anytime we have an opposition, it's often reflected outside of ourselves, usually in the form of relationships. And we can think of an opposition as two ends of the spectrum. And here we have Chiron in Aries opposing Mercury in Libra and conjunct the full moon, right? So the full moon is really highlighting, the lights, is what we call the sun and the moon, are just sort of floodlighting the Chiron in Aries, and the opposite, the Mercury. It's kind of like what we're doing is no longer a joke. There is something there with Chiron opposite Mercury, where we don't want to, maybe certain things don't land properly. What we're trying to communicate may or may not be heard properly. And, maybe we can be afraid of being ridiculed or being made fun of. And that's why this can be a very triggering full moon, because our insecurities and our vulnerabilities and our wounds are emerging now in one way or another. Again, often in terms of relationships. Maybe we can just see ourselves in reflection in a relationship. Who are we being when we're being a certain way in a relationship? What does it say about me? What's being reflected about my identity? In evolutionary astrology, Chiron often has a theme of guilt and a need to atone for guilt. And so atonement is, really honestly asking for forgiveness. And it's not just in the asking, but it's in the putting oneself in the position, in that vulnerable position of admitting that they're wrong, or admitting their guilt, the admitting their shame. And so, perhaps we need to right an imbalance in a relationship. Perhaps one person's selfishness, Aries, has been hurtful in a relationship, has caused an imbalance in a relationship. Maybe we felt unworthy of another person's love. Or perhaps it's time we ask for help, as I said, and accept that help. And now, the other major signifier here is we've got Saturn in a T-square, aspecting these planets, right? So Saturn is squaring not only the Sun and Mercury in Libra, but also the Chiron and Moon in Aries. So that is some intense karmic pressure, as Saturn tends to apply pressure so that we can become stronger in an area. And a T-square is, you focus on the apex usually, because that's just sort of like this urgent, the urgency is coming from the apex, which is the Saturn and Capricorn. And Saturn, we've been talking so much about Saturn and Capricorn all year, but ever since Saturn entered Capricorn in December, Saturn rules Capricorn, so it's in its rulership. So the karmic implications are strong. Saturn is not giving an inch. We need to atone for our wrongdoings. We need to face the music. We made our bed. It's time to sleep in it. All these things that have to do with, karma coming home to roost. I think there's like a million different sayings about that, but it all really is relevant when we're talking about Saturn in Capricorn. And so it being, this intense pressure on this entire configuration is really saying there is no escape. This is something that we must face. We must face the music. Now, Saturn square Chiron, if we were to look at that, because those are some, really, I'd say a standout aspect within this configuration, Saturn being so strong in Capricorn, and of course, Chiron being highlighted, our wounds being highlighted. There's actually a really beautiful podcast episode on the Astrology University podcast with Stephen Forrest. I think it's only about like 15 or 20 minutes, but he really goes deeply into the Saturn square Chiron as being an aspect about stoicism and being stoic, and I think that is really well conceptualized, because Chiron being our wounds, and in Chiron and Aries, I'm from the Chiron and Aries generation, those born from like 68 to 77. And we really don't want to show our wounds. And part of it is probably because we have a hard time identifying it, because when it comes to our very identity, we really want to mask that. Often it has to do with taking on another's identity in order to feel like we have one of our own. When something like this, though, happens with the Saturn and the full moon highlighting it, we're really asked, what is my true identity? Who am I without the crutch of teachers or quoting other people, using other people's ideas or words? But getting back to the Saturn square Chiron being about stoicism, Chiron being our wounds, and as I said, in Aries, we tend to really want to mask them. Well, the Saturn squaring it is really putting pressure on that. So that stoicism is like, I've got to work through these wounds. It's like as if you have to do some hard work and you cut your thumb or something like that, and you still have to work through it and find a way to adapt even through the pain. And as Stephen Forrest had said, that it's about meeting our limits. We often hear about pushing past our limits, but in fact, we all have limits, and that's what makes them limits. We cannot go past them. We are limited there, and so Saturn, especially Saturn in Capricorn, really requires that we work in discipline and persistence, and eventually our barrier of our limit can move, right? But when we have a limit, that's a limit. So we may be facing our limits. Maybe we're facing our age. Those of us within the Chiron generation are coming up to our Chiron return. That's age 50, 51. And that is a major turning point. Maybe we're facing our physical limits. And Saturn can make us feel old. And we need to recognize that right now, this is my limit. And I can't go past here unless I do the work that's required of me. Maybe that means that atoning that we were talking about. Maybe that just means being patient, being stoic. There's always these opportunities. When we get this opportunity to atone, ask for forgiveness, or maybe be the one to forgive, we can take them or not. The stoicism, we may be so ingrained in our being right that we don't take the opportunity, and that likely won't serve us. When we look at things from a karmic perspective, I never knew anything about this Yom Kippur holiday, the Jewish Yom Kippur. I'm sorry, I'm so ignorant about it, but I just had been learning about it this past week, and it is so incredibly beautiful. How beautiful to have an entire couple of days meditating on the idea of forgiveness and atonement, and actually saying, I forgive you. And I actually happened to ask a woman that I knew for forgiveness. I had no idea it was Yom Kippur, which she was celebrating in Israel of all places. And she told me about the holiday, and she said, yes, I forgive you. No hard feelings. I just thought that was so interesting. No hard feelings. Because when we are being hardened, then there is no space to forgive. When we truly do forgive, then there's no hard feelings. And as someone who was receiving that forgiveness, it just felt like such grace, even though it was, the grand scheme of things, like such a small thing. You just really feel a touch of grace when someone forgives you in that way. And so just looking at, the possibilities and the potentials of this T-square and what it can mean. Saturn is such a call for discipline and maturity and responsibility. I'm an evolutionary astrologer, and there's so much emphasis on the outer planets, the liberation of Uranus and the metamorphosis of Pluto and the transcendence of Neptune. But actually, I've come to really appreciate Saturn and Capricorn because they are spiritual as well. It is about bringing in the spirit, merging it with matter, matter being a conduit for spirit. They aren't separate, actually. And Capricorn is about, sort of that initiatory experience of taking the maturity, a spiritual maturity, and making it real in the world. And so what's also significant is Saturn is joined with goddess Vesta. I love Vesta. If you want to look up the Vestal Virgins and look at that mythology, but essentially Vesta represents the sacred duty. And in a sign like Capricorn, where duty and responsibility are emphasized, we see Saturn as our karmic responsibility, and Vesta is our devotion. It's really being fully devoted, and in a way that enlivens us, that enlivens our soul. So it's different than the idea of sacrifice. It's actually about an enlivening devotion. In Demetra George's work on the asteroid goddesses, she aligns Vesta with the ascendant. And she actually makes that distinction that it isn't about sacrifice where you're being drained, but it's about a devotion that actually makes one much more aligned with the self. And so I thought that was very illuminating, that it's sacred service to that which one's soul cherishes. And so both Vesta and Saturn at the full moon are at 2 degrees Capricorn. And so the Sabian symbol for the 3rd degree of Capricorn, because you always round up, is a human soul in its eagerness for new experiences seeks embodiment. And I love that. That's one of my favorite degrees. I don't have a natal planet there though, but a human soul in its eagerness for new experiences seeks embodiment, right? So it's that soul craving birth, craving ensoulment, embodiment in the world. I guess sometimes when we're having a bad day, we might think, why on earth would we want this human experience? But when we think about it, it's a way for the soul to express itself, to play, to grow. It's actually, many of these spiritual teachers have said that the soul uses the earthly experience in order to learn and to grow. You don't die and suddenly you become perfect. This is where you are learning. In Earth School, your soul is eager for these new experiences, is learning and growing, or has the opportunity to. And so I did want to also mention briefly that if you want to look more into this Chiron archetype, I have a YouTube video that I did through EA Zoom meetings. Thank you, Linda Johnson, for inviting me to speak with the group. And this one I did right when Chiron was ingressing Aries. And that was on Chiron, the Wounded Maverick, where I explored the charts and the lives of 2 Chironic individuals, the fashion designer Alexander McQueen, who had a very interesting chart. Chiron in Aries conjunct the North Node. And so that, we know that the North Node is really this calling to our destiny. And so he definitely was one that really embodied the Chiron and Aries archetype. I also did a little piece, I wish I'd had more time, on the feminist artist Anna Mendieta, who was born with Chiron conjunct the sun. So her Chiron was really illuminated in Scorpio, right? And so Scorpio was the other sign ruled by Mars. And she had just a very, consider her a feminist artist. Her work was very raw and very deep and very dark and really visceral. She brought her wounds into the artistic space. So both of these were very fascinating Chironic figures. So you can go on YouTube and Google Chiron the Wounded Maverick, Christina Caudill, or you can go into the EA Zoom group in Facebook. You can find it there. So that is all I have for this episode. Again, if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave me a review on the iTunes app. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Radiant Astro for daily starcasts. And don't forget to subscribe free to radiantastrology.com for my upcoming events, notifications, and special offers just for subscribers. And have a beautiful and hopefully healing full moon in Aries. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.